So, my wife is a qualified nursery nurse. Because she's good at her job, she's on good terms with most of the parents of the children in her room, and from time to time, some of the parents would ask her to babysit for them on the side, knowing that their children already feel comfortable with her and that because of her job, she's the perfect candidate for looking after children privately in their homes. One day, the parents of one of the quieter children asked her to babysit for them whilst they're at a function. Now, they lived quite far away, a lot further than she's normally prepared to go, but like most things in life, the money was good, so she didn't think twice. She asked me to drive her there and pick her up as the house is on the middle of Dartmoor and she wasn't confident driving through country lanes. Now, when I say it was on the middle of the moors, I mean there wasn't a house for miles. It's the type of place where if you spend too long outside at night, even the wind howling will sound like someone whispering to you out from the darkness. As a good husband that I am, I drive her to this house. We get there after a 30-minute drive to find this old, worn-down cottage, draped in darkness and aesthetically exactly how you'd imagine a stereotypical farmhouse to look. Outhouses, barns, and a thatched-roofed cottage complete with chicken coops and various old farming equipment that I can only imagine has laid dormant on the grounds for many, many years. Almost like a shrine to a forgotten time when engines and automatic equipment were a new invention and farmers still relied on hard work and tools that had been passed down for generations, having never failed before. She gets out of the car and I kiss her goodbye and she's enveloped into the darkness as she walks towards the front door. My headlights illuminating the house in the type of way that makes it look like it's menacingly staring at you. Now, signal is non-existent on the moors. Even in this day and age, being able to make a phone call on your mobile or even text is a luxury limited to the outskirts closer to the main towns. I didn't hear from her until I picked her up later that night. When I saw the front door open, she bolted and ran to the car, not once looking back. I thought she was excited to see me, but when I saw her face, it was pale and she'd obviously been crying. She told me to drive, and for 10 minutes we sat in silence. An awkward, unnerving silence. After she composed herself, she told me what had happened. The night had started like any other. After she'd arrived, the parents greeted her and gave a quick tour of the house. The boy she was babysitting was already ready for bed and the parents left for their function. After watching some cartoons, she ushered the boy upstairs to bed and read him a story. The boy was around 4 or 5, I can't quite remember. About an hour later, she heard movement upstairs. Thinking nothing of it, she continued reading her book, but the noise became louder to the point where she went upstairs and found the boy hiding under his bed. She scolded the boy for being out of bed when he should be sleeping, but the boy seemed frightened and was adamant that there were monsters in the house. My wife told him that monsters aren't real and put him back to bed. She went back downstairs and another hour passed when she heard noises coming from upstairs again, louder and different from before. Before she had a chance to get up, she heard a boy scream, so she raced upstairs to the boy's room, but he wasn't there. She reached upstairs for him and eventually found him cowering in fear in the bathroom. He'd hidden in a wicker laundry basket, the type with a lid that you could still see through. The boy was scared beyond belief, she later told me on the drive home. She'd comforted him for a little while, and seemed confident that he was fine after explaining that scratching noises were probably mice in between the floorboards and there was nothing to be frightened of. Ghosts and monsters aren't real, and that there's definitely nothing in the house he should be afraid of. By now, she was starting to get a little scared herself. She was on the middle of the moors, in a house she wasn't familiar with, and although the boy had believed her explanation of a family of mice living under the floorboards, she was starting to doubt herself, and her thoughts turned to the thinking that there was something else in the house. She'd been reading her book for about an hour when the old grandfather clock in the entrance hall started chiming midnight. She'd sat listening to it, all the while surveying her old unfamiliar surroundings. Old houses always have a spooky feel to them, but whilst the clock was chiming, it was almost as if the house was changing, becoming something sinister, she'd said. When the clock chimed the final tone to signify midnight, all the lights in the house went out, and even to this day she swears blind that she heard something growl in the darkness. Now, the parents had advised that because the house was old, they'd experienced power cuts all the time, and they explained how to reset the electric box to bring everything back. But before she had a chance to investigate, she heard another scream from upstairs. She raced upstairs, which proved difficult in the complete darkness, and entered the boy's room. He was hiding under his covers, but even in the darkness, she could make out his shape under the duvet. The boy was visibly shaking as my wife could see the covers fidget. After telling him that everything was alright and that the power had just gone, he muttered, "There's monsters." Losing sight of fear and becoming a little bit short with him, she reiterated for the third time that there are no monsters, and to prove it, she'd look around in his room, in the jovial, obvious way that someone would search for monsters, to prove that there are none to a child. She looked under his bed. "No monsters here," she said. She checked his windows to make sure they were locked and secure. "No monsters getting in here," she confirmed. Finally, she walked to his wardrobe. It was one of those wardrobes that was built into the room and was very deep. Opened the door and poked around, and sure enough, there's no monsters in here either. She was about to close the door when she heard heavy breathing from the back of the wardrobe. She slowly drew back the clothes on the rail and peered into the back of the wardrobe, and there, hugging his knees and rocking backwards and forwards, was the boy. "There's a monster in my bed," he said without looking up, too scared to even acknowledge my wife's presence. My wife turned her head slowly, and the bundle that she'd assumed was the boy in bed was still there, under the covers, but it had set up, and her eyes having adjusted slightly to the darkness, she could see through the thin cover that whatever it was looking at her. She grabbed the boy and ran downstairs to the living room. The only source of light in the house was the fire that the parents had set before leaving. For an entire hour, she and the boy hid under a blanket in the living room. All the while, the noises she'd heard earlier continued upstairs. Scratching, pacing, and a gravely moaning. The type of noises something makes when it's looking for something unsuccessfully. Finally, after what she described as an eternity, but in hindsight couldn't have been long, the parents showed up. They duly paid her, something she now considers not worth the experience, and they asked if she was available for another night. She politely declined. It wasn't until a few weeks later that she told the parents what had happened when they'd come to pick up the boy from nursery. They weren't surprised. She had been the 5th babysitter in as many months that wouldn't come back. They said they'd experienced things all the time, but never to that extent. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why my wife no longer babysits privately.